Sarah.
Hi, Jackie.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. With a little reservation in my voice. I'm taking another departure from my normal issues of discussion for blogging heads and wading into what I feel is a little bit of a minefield, and I'm a little trepidatious about this discussion, but I'm game, and I'm gonna try to make it worthwhile. I guess I'm reluctant. We're going to talk about the issue of Islamic dress for women, covering the hijab, the niqab, and all of its variations. And I guess I'm a little bit reluctant because fundamentally I just feel that clothing is an issue of personal choice. And the idea of me as a non-Muslim woman talking about this in a way that might appear to pass judgment is something I'm sort of very uncomfortable with. On the other hand, this issue is kind of underlying a lot of Christian, Muslim, or Western, Eastern relationships now, and certainly in my own little neighborhood, in my own little world, it's more and more something that kind of we see and confront. And so I think that it might be useful to just talk about it and kind of get some things out in the open and see if we can reach some mutual understanding about it.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to talk about. I think our conversation in a way is almost helping set a little bit of a model for how we can talk about this, because of course people feel that there are some issues that they think are personal and private, and it makes it difficult to kind of talk about it with the person who's actually practicing it. And I was talking earlier with somebody, it's almost like sexuality in a way,
right.
And the whole issue of covering connects to that as well. So I think it's, in a way, we're kind of laying a little bit of a foundation, if you will.
Okay, well,
just about how to have a dialogue, how to converse about this, just between everyday people. And I like to kind of qualify that I'm not really an expert, like a scholar in any way. I'm just kind of a lay person trying to understand my religion and trying to practice in the best way. And I've gone through a journey with that, and I can speak about that as well.
Maybe that's a good place to start, because I think what makes your story so interesting to women like myself, and you and I sort of we sort of come from sort of similar educational backgrounds, we're similar age, we're both mothers, and I think that you've made some choices about how you're going to practice your faith, but it wasn't always that way. So do you want to just say where you went to school and a little bit about your background and what you've studied? And
just a quick history, a personal history. I came to this country when I was about 8 years old, and we came from India, and I went to private school starting high school. I went to a very kind of elite all-girls school, so I was in a gender-segregated environment there. On the Upper East Side, and
what school did you go to on the Upper East
Side? I went to Chapin.
And so you were right in the thick of the...
all of while I was growing up, of course I had a lot of different kinds of identity issues being from an observant Muslim family. Though my family, there wasn't like a dress code in the sense of covering the hair, though my mom did cover her hair. But we were never told that we had to cover our hair. We were just told that we had to kind of dress modestly, meaning like wearing long sleeve shirts and long skirts and pants, things like that. But then I went off to college. I went to Princeton, and while I was in college, like many young people do, I questioned a lot about my own kind of upbringing and what it meant to be Muslim, and particularly what it meant to be a Muslim woman. And I had a lot of trouble with the way that, at that point in my life, with the way that Islam, my understanding of Islam and the role for women that it prescribed. And I didn't cover my hair. And I just had a lot of questions. And I actually got to a point in my questioning where I almost felt like almost wanted to drop my faith altogether. But I had a really great professor a religion professor named Malcolm Diamond, who really helped kind of remind me that he said it's really important if you've had an upbringing in a certain religion to kind of stick with it and really explore what it means for you. So I didn't kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I guess through graduate school, I went off to do a degree in communication at the Edinburgh School and at the University of Pennsylvania. And there I started to explore more of what it meant for me in a different way to be Muslim. And I thought about trying to become more observant. And I thought about possibly covering, and so I didn't actually do anything about it until later. After I graduated, I had a child, and then I started to think even more of myself as a role model and what I wanted to kind of impart to my child. And so then at that point, I started to cover my hair, and I did it very gradually. I would kind of experiment with what it felt like. And
so now, can I ask, were you working when you made the decision to start covering your hair?
At the time, I think I was actually writing my dissertation. So I wasn't working, no. But when I defended my dissertation, I went into my defense with my head covered. And that was interesting because nobody said anything to me about it. And I think that that goes back to the question we started with, which is how do you kind of acknowledge or make a conversation about this decision, which seems to be a personal decision.
Right. Right. Okay. So just getting back to when you were growing up, because you went to a high school, which is, I think today there are sort of 3 elite girls' schools in Manhattan, and at least one of them is sort of the setting for the fictitious and wildly popular show Gossip Girls, which I have to say I haven't watched. I caught a little bit.
I haven't
of one
either.
Episode. But it's like it has a huge cult following, and I'm sure if I were 14, I'd know everything about the show. But what was so you went through your adolescence in this sort of very highly secular, wealthy environment on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and then you went up to Princeton. And how did those experiences shape your decision? I mean, setting aside the professor that you had at Princeton, but do you ever go back for reunions to your high school or to college? And I mean, how does that sort of square with the person you were then? I'm just curious about.
I actually, I have to actually qualify something about my experience, which is that even though I went to an elite private school, we ourselves live in the Bronx, so I was always navigating this like rich-poor divide every day on a daily basis because my family is not a wealthy, family. But when I recently, I actually have not gone back to any reunions, and most of it is because it's kind of logistical, difficult to manage the timings. But I think part of it is also my own hesitation about how like people would view me in kind of my new garb.
Right.
And it for my friends, most of my friends who I've kept in touch with, both from high school and college, they've kind of. We could still continue to be friends. I haven't lost any friends as a result of, changing my dress. But I do feel a little awkward about it. But I think I'm slowly getting to a point where I will feel more open to doing that.
I'm wondering if there are any girls at Chapin now who cover their hair. There must be Muslim students at Chapin, and I live across the street from Princeton High School, and there are a couple of young women at the high school who wear the hijab. And,
okay.
Well, maybe we should just sort of back up a little bit and just talk about sort of the mechanics of Muslim head covering and sort of the continuum of options that there are open to women. You've chosen the hijab. There are others. Do you want to just explain a little bit about the few name options for women who choose to cover themselves?
Yeah, sure. So the word hijab is actually, it doesn't even mean head covering in the traditional kind of usage in the Quran. It actually means curtain. But it's been adopted to kind of refer to this a scarf that people wear on their heads or just covering generally. But people will also use the word scarf to talk about a head covering. But then there are also other variations on modest dress in terms of like the way I grew up, and I have 2 sisters who don't cover, but just wearing long sleeves and longer length skirts and pants, that's also modest, and just not wearing clothing that reveals the shape of the body. That would be also modest dressed. And then there's all the way up to wearing a niqab, which is a covering of everything on the face except the eyes. And that's kind of, and I guess I've gone through part of that spectrum. I haven't gone to the niqab phase of it, and that's partly because there's actually a legitimate theological difference of opinion about whether or not the niqab is required for women. There's more consensus among scholars that the hijab is actually required, like the scarf on the head, that your head should be covered. There's more of a consensus on that among scholars, but there isn't a consensus about the niqab.
Okay, so this is something that I think a lot of people kind of maybe they won't say it in polite company, but they might think it, and that is that the niqab, for example, the chador, the abaya, the full covering with just the eyes visible. How can there be? I can understand how smart people can disagree about biofuels or about nuclear energy, good or bad, but I have a hard time understanding how scholars can sort of sit around and argue intelligently about whether it's good or allowed or not allowed for women to cover their entire bodies except for their eyes with black cloth. I can't imagine, what kind of, thought process is behind the argument that this is the pro niqab argument. Can you explain that?
I can talk about a little bit. Again, I'm not a scholar, so I don't know all of the details, but I think that a lot of this, and I think it's similar for Judaism and probably other religions too, that a lot of the arguments and differences of opinion in terms of traditional religious scholarship are really based on people's interpretations of texts and what they choose to emphasize in the text, or how the text has been derived and what they know of that. So the scholars who would argue for the niqab are basing their argument on certain texts in the Quran and in the Hadith, which the Quran being, the text that Muslims consider to be a revealed text, and then the Hadith, which are a series of sayings about how the Prophet Muhammad lived his life. So scholars look to those two texts to derive their rulings on a range of issues, and niqab is one of them. And so that's what it's based on. And the intention for both sides is to try to emulate kind of the prophetic practice. So there's a difference of opinion about whether, the face covering is required for all women, or was it only required for the women, that were the prophets, in the prophet's family. So there's that kind of thing. And there are other texts that say that, women don't have to, their hair and their face and their hands can be exposed.
I understand that there's a legitimate issue about what the texts say.
Right.
I guess it's my question is the implementation of what the texts say. I can understand if one end of the continuum is women wearing the hijab, and then the other end of the continuum is women dressing, like they might for a day at the beach in Miami or something. But it's just hard for me to sort of understand in, contemporary society why the other end of the continuum is sort of set at the niqab. I understand why maybe hundreds of years ago that was the case, but it's hard for me to understand why there hasn't been sort of an evolution. For example, in Hasidic, we talked about this a little bit, in sort of Hasidic and Judaism, Satmar or Lubavitcher sects. Women certainly are expected to cover their bodies almost entirely, but not their faces, and certainly not with a shapeless black garment. But let me just ask you this: do you know any women who wear the niqab?
Actually, none of my close circle of friends do, but we have some family friends, and one of their daughters, and actually two families, and one of their daughters in each family does cover her face. But then there are other women in the family who don't.
Where do they live, the women who cover their faces?
One lives in New York, and the other one, actually, I don't remember where the other one moved to, but they live in the States.
Okay, so
yeah.
does that would it shock you? I mean, does that shock you a little bit that a woman living in the United States in a family where it's not necessarily the practice norm would opt to do that?
It doesn't shock me. I mean, I think that it kind of, I respect that as her choice to do that if she chooses. I mean, I personally don't think that for me, it makes sense to do that, and I think that part of how, and this connects back to the question we were talking about, how scholars have different opinions, because in giving rulings about what is, normative in terms of religion, scholars also look at the application of texts in the contemporary setting. And I think part of the difference of opinion there about niqab is also whether it makes sense for women to wear the niqab, given, the need to kind of be able to communicate about Muslims and Islam to a wider world, and just how it might kind of block the communication a bit. But it doesn't shock me. I just don't think that it doesn't make sense to me, and I don't see a lot of people kind of adopting it.
No, I mean, it's clearly not grand, widespread. But I mean, I see it in New York now. I don't think I saw it 15 years ago, and certainly in Europe. And okay, so there was the case. Maybe we should talk about the case of the French woman who was denied citizenship because she wears the niqab.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people would read that ruling of the French government, like myself, and say, I kind of see where France is coming from on this. I don't like the idea of France banning headscarves in the classroom. I think that that's just, really within the realm of the personal. But I kind of understand this notion of can this woman who has chosen to kind of segregate herself from society in this way, can she sort of adopt French, the sort of French, the sort of foundation of their civil society, which is, separation of church and state and the equality of the sexes. And I think that was sort of the argument that they made, that clearly she's not able to embrace this notion that men and women are equal if this is her sort of approach to... I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a little ridiculous to tie up citizenship with mode of dress, personally, because I think that we also need to remember, I mean, there's what about, why do we always focus on women and women's dress? Right. And it's really annoying.
Because it's
and
totally
I feel
annoying,
even in, the kind of, people always like to talk about the hijab, but nobody talks about men's dress.
Yeah, but just to,
and that's
just
true
to be
for
clear.
all, for the Jewish tradition as well, because men have a certain prescribed dress, but nobody points that out as a problem.
Well, but wait. Men in Islam, in the West, Muslim men who live in the West, for the most part, wear pants and a shirt, just like my husband. And Orthodox Jewish men wear, a kippah or but there's not. You have to admit that there's a significant difference between how, Muslim men in the West are dressing and some Muslim women in the West are dressing.
I mean, there is a difference, but there are men who wear traditional dress, Muslim men who wear traditional dress. There are also other men, like in the Sikh community, who wear turbans. I just think that it doesn't make sense to tie up the niqab with citizenship, also because we're setting a precedent, I think, as Western democratic countries about how democracy ought to be practiced. And if we want to kind of impart that model to other countries, then to include dress as a criteria for whether or not someone becomes a citizen doesn't make sense. If you think about it the opposite way. In a Muslim country, does that mean that if a woman doesn't absorb the normative code of dress, in her country, and she's, an immigrant to a Muslim country, should she be denied citizenship?
I don't think anyone would say that. But let's just try to get.
But my point is that it's setting a model for how to practice democracy, and I think that that's something that we forget. Living in America, living in Europe, is that we, as in enacting these policies, we are showing the world how democracy is practiced. And that's what democracy is for me. It's a process. It's not like we're already democratic and this is what we're going to do. It's about,
I
this
don't,
is democracy.
there's nothing in what you say that I would disagree with at all,
Right,
really,
right.
at all. But what I do think it's worth exploring a little bit more is what's behind the woman who chooses to wear the niqab, for example. Let's just sort of setting aside that, this is just the way she wants to dress and she feels good this way and likes it and whatever. But what sort of, can we sort of unpack a little bit about the assumptions inherent in that choice? For example, let's talk about modesty for a minute.
I want to go back to something you said before, which is about how the niqab kind of challenges the social order or the idea that men and women are equal. Because that is an interpretation that's been imposed on women's covering, that if somebody chooses to cover themselves, whether it's even, the headscarf or even the niqab, that it says something about how they think men and women are not equal. And that's absolutely not the case, because within Islam, for me as a woman who covers, there is no question in my mind that men and women are equal. And I think that it's also about the reference point. For observant Muslims,
so can we just
the
go
reference
back
point
to
is
this
also,
for a second?
it's not society and the equality that's manifest in society. It's about whether or not you're equal in the eyes of God.
Okay, so let's just agree. I completely agree with you, but I want to just talk about this issue about male and female equality a little more, because we have the Olympics coming up, for example. And, one thing that I think is sort of just prima facie clear is that Muslim countries do not produce large numbers of elite female athletes. They produce plenty of male athletes, but not so many women athletes are going to be competing in Beijing in track and field and other swimming and other sports. And I think that, part of the underlying reason for that is that in a large part of the Islamic world, women, because of restrictions on, the dictates of modest dress and other things, are sort of it's not open to them to sort of enjoy the physicality of their gender in a way that would lead ultimately to maybe becoming an elite athlete or something else. So let's just talk about women who, encouraging women, for example, to learn to swim in the Muslim world. Let's setting aside becoming a gold medal winning athlete, but how do you reconcile this notion of equality of the sexes with the, prima facie observable case that women in the Muslim world are not allowed to sort of be physical in the public sphere?
Well, I think this goes back to how you define public and private, because there are many women in the Middle East and South Asia who know how to swim because there are single-sex swimming clubs.
Right.
So they're being fully athletic, and they're doing it in a way that
but they're
allows them
relegated
to
to
explore
doing
their
it in a private way.
physicality, to develop. And I think it also has to do with why our expectation that the only valid participation in terms of athletics is the Olympics. Maybe it's not. Maybe there are other things that women can do. And there's also a growing movement to kind of accept a mode of dress that would allow participation in these co-ed forums. So I think we need to look at that kind of change as well, because slowly Muslim women are joining these things, and they're doing it in a way that is, that makes sense for them in terms of covering, but also being athletic in the way they want to be.
But what about the idea that they shouldn't have to cover if they want to be? Can you be a good Muslim woman and be an elite swimmer if you want to be, and just wear a one-piece bathing suit?
I think it really depends on who you ask. There are lots of Muslims who don't observe, the dress code, and they would consider themselves Muslim, and that's,
right.
That's not really for me to decide whether or not they're a good Muslim.
Right.
It's just how people are observing the faith. I really think it depends on who you ask.
So, you mentioned to me when we talked earlier that you have a son and you send him to a Muslim school in New York, which is a co-ed school.
Mm-hmm.
And the girls at your son's school, do they adopt head covering at a certain age?
They have a school uniform which requires them to cover their hair. Yeah, starting at a young age.
What's the how old are they when they? Is it adolescence or?
No, it's like even in first grade.
Really?
First and second grade. I mean, you see a lot of the girls covering their hair. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't remember exactly what the school rule is as far as who needs to. I don't remember when it starts that they have to wear it. But there are also girls who come to the school and wear the scarf but don't wear it outside. So they're observing kind of a uniform.
So
I'm not sure that I personally entirely agree with this idea of asking girls to cover their hair in the school. But if I were in an administrative role, I might not have made the same decision.
I thought that in most even observant schools, girls were not expected to cover their hair until puberty. I think in Saudi Arabia and in other countries, it's really like, say, 12 when girls start to cover their hair in public.
Yeah, it is. But I think it's also about, I think schools that might have this is kind of like a training ground and just helping girls feel comfortable with that. That might be the logic of it. But as I said, I don't remember exactly what the grade is when it's required.
Okay, so the girls at your son's school start covering their hair at a very early age. And now, are there girls who just decide, it's not for me, I love this school, I'm a good Muslim, but I'm not interested in covering my hair?
Are there girls in the school that do that?
Right. Are there any girls who just say, I've done it for a while, and I'm a very observant Muslim, and I pray with my family, and I'm a good girl, but I just don't choose to cover my hair?
To my knowledge, that hasn't happened so far, but it might happen in the future. I don't know.
If it did happen, would that girl be accepted, or would she be ostracized for her? Would she be allowed to just do her own thing, or would she be discouraged?
Since it's part of the uniform, I think there would it would just be like any other thing that if somebody chooses, like one day my son didn't have the right sneakers for gym, so he couldn't play. So I imagine that if it's part of the uniform, that's what it would be like. So, like I said, if I were in an administrative role, I might not have imposed the same, rule, I guess, uniform.
I mean, I think it's interesting what you say about how the reason you think maybe it started early is so that girls could become comfortable with it as they get older. Because another way of looking at it would be, isn't it important to make sure that girls are comfortable crossing over into, mainstream American society where most women don't cover their hair, and do they need to be comfortable in that society as a...
Yeah.
Or sort of maybe making it the kind of thing where you'll make a choice that sometime in your life you'll cover your hair now because we want to teach you how to, be comfortable doing this, but later on you'll make your own decision about it. Is that sort of implicit in the pedagogy of the school?
That's actually a good question, and I have to say that for a lot of religious schools, and I imagine this to be true for other religions as well, but certainly for my son's school, one of the questions I have for them is in terms of pedagogy, how they're preparing the kids to enter a wider world, which is very diverse. And I asked that question about, whether to keep my son in that school. It's a very important question for me, something I think about a lot. And he's in that school because I myself, like when I was growing up, we didn't have a choice about what kind of school to go to. We just went to this, it was public school, private school, but there were no Muslim schools really in New York that I was aware of when I was younger. So when I had the choice, I just thought, well, this is an important experience for him to have, and it's an identity-affirming experience because growing up, I didn't have an affirmation of my Muslim identity at all in the society around me, and it was always derided and looked down upon, and it's almost like my way of protecting him from something, but at the same time, I want him to be challenged, and be ready to face the challenge of being in a diverse world, and so I make sure that I personally take him to things where he's exposed to different people, like whether it's in summer camp or not, and the school is actually doing more to try to, get the kids to participate in projects that involve other kids kids who aren't Muslim.
The girls at your son, and I realize you don't have a daughter at the school, so you may not know
yes,
all
I don't.
of this. But
I might answer all these questions very differently if I had a daughter. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the girls at your son's school, do they play sports after school on teams?
Yes, they do, and they have teams, and they do play.
And they compete with other schools?
Yeah.
And they wear their head coverings when they're playing soccer?
Well, they don't. I mean, they will if it's in a public setting. But if they're just playing on their own and it's like gym time, then they don't. And
okay. I mean, I guess
because they have separate gym periods for boys and girls.
Okay, so let's just get back to this whole issue of modesty and why women should have to cover their hair in the first place. Because I think this is this is really what I just think, women like myself struggle with understanding. I understand the issue of personal choice, but I don't understand why it's necessarily a manifestation. Why of all the human values that it's important to foster in people, kindness, compassion, why modesty specifically seems to get this. It almost seems it's not unique to Islam by any means, because lots of other religions in various forms, have modesty as kind of a central element. But why, this sort of, it seems a little bit to live a little larger, maybe for you or maybe for other people, maybe not. But so can you talk about the modesty issue and how you define it and how central it is to your practice of your faith?
So, we were talking about modesty and how we define the term modesty itself, because I think for people, when they see somebody who's covering and being quote-unquote modest, it entails a sense of kind of feeling ashamed or trying to cover up something that they're not doing.
See, no, I might disagree with that. I mean, I think of modesty as just being unassuming in your personal affect, just somebody who's not really boastful, and, I don't see that there's an element of shame in it, actually.
Okay, well, that's really good to know. I think that why modesty is important, I think, for Muslims, because it goes back to kind of, this idea of struggling with the ego, and that's very important in terms of a Muslim's practice of their faith, is just, how does your ego allow you to or not allow you to relate to God? And I think there are different ways that our ego is at play, and it could be in a range of things. It could be in interactions. It could be in our dress, because we want to look attractive, we want to look beautiful. So I think the reference point is like, in the Islamic worldview, we want to have kind of a worshipful, observance of God in all of our practice, whether it's prayer or whether it's just daily life or whether it's interacting with other people. And so anything that would kind of question that and would elevate something or a person or society as a reference point above God will be considered problematic. So like, whose standards are we observing? So in that way, because the ego is wrapped up in how we look and making ourselves attractive to others, like, that's part of why the modesty notion comes in. And I'm using modesty very broadly here. I'm not saying necessarily that it's about head covering or niqab. I mean, it's just thinking about generally how we dress. And there are lots of women, if there might be women who are not at all, not Muslim, just sort of the average person walking down the street, who make choices about how they're going to dress just because of their own sense of modesty. Like, people might not choose to wear tank tops,
I mean, I would certainly put myself in that category. Yeah. I would agree entirely with that.
Yeah.
But what I think strikes some people like myself who can really understand and accept what you say about a non-egocentric, way of interacting with your faith, completely understandable. The niqab sort of has the effect of erasing the self. It's sort of making the woman invisible, and making her, just erasing her. And I think that women like myself just have a really hard time understanding how you can, granting that you can want to be not terribly egocentric in your faith, but not to the point of erasing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand your concern, and even notwithstanding that concern, I can understand it. But I also think that even if somebody chooses to dress in a way that completely covers themselves or completely exposes themselves, that still doesn't mean that they should be denied certain rights that other people have.
No, I wouldn't. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that I think,
and I share, and I haven't. I share a little bit of your discomfort. Probably not as much because it's just part of the culture that I'm a part of. Yeah.
People who decide to be clothing optional, nudist, that's clearly a choice that person's making themselves, right? To not cover at all. But in some parts of the Muslim world, it has not been a choice for women to cover and not cover. It's been sort of imposed in almost a totalitarian way.
That's important to me. I think that it really needs to be
right. So I think that this is really at the root of why it is women, some people have a really hard time understanding why you would choose to do this to yourself. Why would you choose to wear a niqab yourself if the government is out of the picture? And I wonder, I mean, that's why I was curious about the people who are in a family where they've chosen to do that. I mean, is it the same thing? We were talking about the case of the Hasidic woman, and we can link to the article, who lost custody of her child in the Satmar community, who left the community, and all kinds of problems with her ex-husband and whatnot. Her grandparents, who are not part of the Satmar community,
right,
sort of see their daughter's choice of joining the community as akin to joining a cult. I mean, would you look at women who choose to wear the niqab as sort of adhering to is there anything cult-like in their interpretation of Islam?
I wouldn't call it a cult, no. I mean, I just think that, no, I mean, it's not practiced widely, so for me, that, I don't know, I just see it as a choice. And I think for some families it might be imposed on women. I really don't know, because it's not something that I'm around all the time, but I can see it happening where, maybe the husband or the father would, require a daughter or someone to cover like that. But as far as I know, in the circles that I'm a part of, there's actually counter pressure, I would say, to not wear a niqab, and there's more of a pressure, if anything, to actually just cover the hair. But also, like I said, I mean, before, there are people in my family who don't cover, and I have lots of friends who are Muslim women who don't cover their hair, and that's okay for me and for the people that I'm around.
So are there women of who are pressured to wear the hijab by family members?
Actually, I don't know anyone like that. Every single Muslim woman I know who covers her hair has adopted it as a choice.
And I'm just curious, do you ever forget to put it on, or just want to go outside without it one day?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I don't
daily...
ever forget to put it on. Sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge and a struggle, because it's just an additional thing that I have to think about, and think about matching and all of that stuff. Additional piece of garment. But, and it's a challenge to kind of, look differently than everybody else. Most of the time I don't really think about it, because I've been doing this now for about, I would say 10 years. So it's just become, a second just habit, I guess. But there are days, and I know of women who started to cover and then they chose not to do it anymore because it was difficult. Particularly after 9/11, there were a lot of women, and there were actually religious rulings that were issued that allowed for women to take off their hijab post 9/11, just because it was considered, a matter for their own security. But I just choose to kind of continue with it because it gives me meaning and gives me a sense of coherence that I'd like to continue. And just reminds me of who I am, as just being a Muslim. And I think that, growing up, I spoke before about kind of navigating the class divide, going to, this high school, and all of my life living as an immigrant in this country. And for most people who come from an immigrant culture, you are yourself like a bridge to that culture. And so for me, my hijab is like another bridge that I can bring to a conversation with somebody, because it is, particularly in a post 9/11 world with, the clash of civilizations, like it's a marker, and it shows people immediately that I am Muslim, so it can invite questions and conversations and dialogue. Whereas if I wasn't covering, people might not know immediately, you know. And I'd like to also share like kind of an anecdote, personal anecdote about, you know, my own kind of experience of how people view me on the street and how that's changed. Like growing up, I would have, you know, men whistling at me, you know, staring at me, you know, trying to, you know, touch me on the subway, like all of that stuff. And I grew up with that. And a lot of sexual harassment, and I would tell them to stop harassing me. So I had my own response to that, and I addressed it directly. But after I started wearing the hijab, like that stuff really didn't happen to me anymore. And so that was nice. I mean, it was kind of a protective thing that I just don't have to encounter that on the street walking around.
That's so interesting, because I you know, was in New York City in the 80s as a college student, and certainly have, you know, walked by my share of construction sites. And I have a very different, you know, reaction to it. I mean, I was never sort of physically assaulted in any way, but, you know, certainly heard things like most women do, and I don't know, I don't even notice it. It's like the air. I brush it right off, and now I'm over 40, and it doesn't happen so much anymore. I'm not even wearing a hijab, but whatever. You know, I don't know. I just don't. And I think about raising my daughters in the world. I don't think I'd wanted to not. Certainly, I don't want them to grow up under, you know, threat of physical violence to them. But, you know, like catcalls on the street never bothered me. I wouldn't. I don't know. Not something I'd sort of change my clothing over.
Right.
And I think that's important too. That I think women should just. It's funny. I studied Arabic for a summer in Tunisia, and dressed modestly while I was there. And
well, what was that like?
I mean, it was so. Talk about like men on the street. It was constant. It was obviously. Then this was in 88 or 89. I think 87 or 88. Right. And there was this. I mean, there were like men that would follow me, and it was really upsetting. And I remember phoning home in tears, just like you know, they won't leave me alone, kind of thing. Yeah. And that, like, I wanted sort of massive consciousness raising. I wanted, like, every man in Tunisia to be required to read Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan, like, in like, a crash course. And I wanted, you know, everyone to go on TV and say, this is no way to treat women. This is not acceptable.
Well, I mean, technically all the man needs to do is turn to the Quran, because it tells men to be modest as well and not to harass women and not to even look at women.
I was dressed just the way I was wearing long pants, and I was not immodestly dressed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've had experiences and other women who've relayed experiences where they've been fully covered and gone to do their Hajj, you know, in Mecca and Saudi Arabia, and they've been followed and they've been talked to, and that happened to me also while I was fully covered. But I'm just saying here on the street, it hasn't happened to me. And it's nice because I actually get greeted with, you know, people. I walk down the street and people say Assalamu alaikum to me, who aren't Muslim. So that's kind of nice. It's just a greeting. They're saying hello.
Nice. That's kind of nice.
Because it's just, they know immediately that I'm Muslim. But
well, it strikes me, sort of as we're ending our discussion, that, you know, one interesting thing, I could imagine if you called up, you know, the dean at Chapin and said, you know, here I am, I graduated from your school 20 years ago or whenever, and you know, I bet you they would jump at the opportunity to have you there and talk to their students about your experiences. I just think it's enormously relevant and important for you to kind of share with that world, with especially those girls. Instead of watching Gossip Girl, they could listen to what you have to say, because even if there isn't, you know, fundamental agreement on the choice, I just think it's this kind of a discussion is really important.
Yeah, and it is, and that's, for me, it's like I think I just have to muster up the courage, because I have gone to like other private schools on the east side to do presentations. So, but I think I just need to kind of reconnect myself to my class and go to an alumni luncheon, and I think things will be fine.
I mean, I don't think you should hesitate about it. I think you know, I think what you have to say is really important and worth hearing. I mean, I happen to disagree personally about, you know, some philosophical issues, but I mean, the fundamental issue, I completely think that, you know, it's so vital for women to have the, you know, freedom to make the choice that you've made and to share that thought process with young women especially.
Right, and I also think that it's also about the culture that you're raised up in and what kind of choices are presented to you and what are options and all of that, and just being thoughtful about it. And you're right, it is so important to have the freedom to choose that, and I'm really grateful for having that, and for not living in a place where it's imposed on me, because I would not like that at all.
So just one other quick question.
Yeah.
If you were living in a country where it was imposed on you, how would you handle that? I mean, would you then want to not wear it?
I think that would have been an altogether different journey, really. I might become one of those women who challenged that. Yes, of course, because I do think that it does need to be a choice and not legislated by the government, how women should dress. And also, going back to the example of France, that, policies like citizenship should not include, how people are dressing as part of the criteria for what and not to kind of make assumptions about what people's value systems are, sense of equality, freedom, and all of that, because it's possible to have expressions of equality and freedom and believe in those things in a different way than what we are used to in this culture. So I think we need to be open to hearing about the different approaches to these central concepts of equality, freedom, democracy. What does that mean to people around the world, and how do people want to live their life with those values that might not look exactly like the way we're practicing them here.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, I come back to sort of the issue of the women athletes, and I really wish that the Islamic world could somehow reconcile its views and at the same time allow women to just work to their maximum potential in whatever sphere of life that is, whether it's being a great runner or a great swimmer or a great businesswoman and doing deals with men on their level and as equal partners. And I just think in practice that's not the case.
No, it's not. It's not, definitely not. But I think that for me there are a lot of signs of hope. I mean, the fact that there are women who are coming forward and participating in Olympic events, and they are Muslim women, that for me is a sign that we can see that, changing over time. And there are a lot of women, women like myself and, living in Western democracies who are choosing to, cover themselves but participate fully in the public sphere, are kind of the next generation of women that are also setting a trend for other parts of the world, for Muslim countries. And it's been said that, a lot of countries look to Muslims living in America to set an example. So I think hopefully, we can contribute to a trend that would be worldwide.
Well, on that note, Sarah, thanks for this discussion.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you, Jackie.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Take care.
You too.